Welcome to my note. My name's Esther Slomnickie. I teach biology and AP biology. I have a lot of my students in the room cheering me on. Thank you for coming to learn a little bit about biology with me. So today's presentation is titled Boys Will Be Boys and Girls Will Be Girls, Genes and Gender Determination. So we're going to learn a little bit together about what determines the biological definition of gender. And before we get into the science, we're going to start with two case studies. So this is a picture of a famous middle distance runner named Caspar Semenya. I don't know if everyone has heard of her. She was very much in the news in about 2009. Has anyone heard of her story or anything about her? Yeah? Okay, so she actually won gold in 2009 in the World Championships in her competition. But following her win, she was subjected to gender testing. Okay, and she actually had to withdraw from international competition until 2010, and at that point she was cleared to return to the competition. So the questions that we have about this, and the questions that we're going to approach today are, how could it be unclear what gender she is? Isn't gender a set determination? You're either a male or a female. What questions can we raise about her gender? How can it be unclear about what gender she is? We will revisit her story a little bit later. Okay, we have another person who we're going to talk about, which is Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner. So maybe the younger among us may know Bruce Caitlyn from what? From Keeping Up with the Kardashians, a reality TV show that is on. Bruce Jenner was married to someone named Kris Jenner and has some famous children and stepchildren with her. Khloe Kardashian. The older among us may know Bruce Jenner because he was also a very famous Olympic athlete. He was a decathlon, and he gained fame as this all-American hero after he won in the 1976 Olympics. And from that point on, he continued to have a career in television, in radio, and film. Okay, he was married 3 times and has 6 children. Okay, and very famously, in April of 2015, after he divorced his 3rd wife, Kris Jenner, he revealed that he is a transgender woman, and he publicly changed his name from Bruce to Caitlyn. And this was made public in the Vanity Fair magazine. He was the cover story in July 2015, and his name and gender change became official in September of 2015. She has been called the most famous openly transgender woman in the world. It has been very public because I think she was awarded some awards, like the Woman of the Year or Person of the Year, which a lot of people felt she should not have been given. So it's been a little bit controversial. So the question we have, what it applies to our topic today, is according to the scientific definition, according to the biological definition of gender, is Bruce or Caitlyn a male or a female? How can does his or her definition of gender differ from the previous case study that we're going to talk about, from Caspar Semenya? What are the different factors that come into play when we're discussing Caitlyn's gender and when we're discussing Caspar Semenya's gender? So we're also going to revisit Caitlyn Jenner at the conclusion of our discussion today. Okay, so let's start off by saying, how can we define gender according to science? Okay, what are the factors involved in defining gender? So we could define it at 3 different levels: the chromosomal gender, the gonadal gender, and the phenotypic gender. Okay, I'm going to give a little bit of an explanation of each of these right now, and then we'll delve deeper into each of these during our talk. So what do we mean by chromosomal gender? We mean, what chromosomes does the person have? Is the person XX? If it's XX, do you know what that is? Is that a male or a female? That's female. Or is the person XY? And if the person is XY, typically that is a male. And I say typically because we'll discuss soon some cases where it's not so clear cut. Okay? So we have chromosomal gender. XX is female, XY is male. We have gonadal gender. The term gonad means the organs that produce the gametes, or the reproductive cells. Okay, so typically the male gender contains the male gonad, which are the testes, where sperm cells are produced. The female gender has the female gonad, which are the ovaries, where the egg cells are produced. Okay, so that's another way that we could define what gender somebody is, by what gonads they have. Okay, the third level is called the phenotypic gender. The term phenotype means the physical appearance of somebody. So when we're talking about the phenotypic gender, we mean just from the outside. Do they appear to be male or do they appear to be female? And that includes the external genitals as well as the overall body structure and body shape of a person. Okay, so generally, these three conditions are all linked together. If someone is XX, okay, their chromosomal gender will be female. They will have the female gonads, the ovaries, and they will look female. Okay, if someone's XY, their chromosomal gender will be male. They will have the male gonads of the testes, and they will look male. Okay, but again, we will discuss some situations where it's not always the case. All right, now let's go into a little bit of a further discussion about each of these definitions and what it entails. So let's start off with talking about the chromosomal gender. Okay, so in the past, it wasn't always accepted that the chromosomes is the first starting off point in determining the gender of a person. Okay, Aristotle, back in the year 335 BCE, I don't know if you could see this quote at the bottom. It says, "Male is characterized by an abundance of the superior element fire, whereas the female has an abundance of water and is therefore rather cold." So according to Aristotle, okay, the gender, I don't know how true that is, the gender was determined by the heat of the male partner during the time of conception. Okay, that if the heat of the male could overwhelm the female's coldness, then a male child would form, and he actually counseled men who were trying to have a male heir to try to conceive during the summer where it's just naturally warmer. Okay, he felt that would help. But if the female's coldness was too strong, then a female child would form. And in his definition, he actually considered a female to be almost like a mutilated male, meaning a male whose development stopped too early due to the coldness in the womb. So this, surprisingly, was a popular view for over 1,000 years. Okay, this was the accepted view as to how males and female gender was determined. Okay, and it took until the 16 and 1700s where scientists started to realize that actually females are producing eggs, and these eggs can give over parental traits, okay? And then they started to also study the physiology of the sex organs, okay? But still it took a long time until the actual chromosomes were discovered. In fact, even as late as the 1890s, okay, some scientists believed that things like nutrition and age and environment that the parents were in could influence the gender determination. Two scientists named Geddes and Thompson said that factors that favored the storage of energy and nutrients predisposed one to having female offspring, but factors favoring the utilization of energy and nutrients influenced one to have male offspring. And it wasn't until about 1900, the year 1900, when sex chromosomes were discovered. Okay, and in 1905, two scientists named Stevens and Wilson, they discovered a connection between the sex chromosomes and fruit flies in gender determination. And they saw, in some ways their system is a little bit similar to us, that the male fruit fly has an XY, or actually just one X, XO, and the female fruit fly is XX. So based on their studies, they said this was a strong determination of gender, that it's likely to be this within the nucleus that's determining the gender. And from there until 1959, it was actually in 1959 where a scientist named C.E. Ford discovered in humans that it's definitively the male Y chromosome that makes a male fetus, a human fetus, be male. Okay? So there was a long process in actually discovering these sex chromosomes. Let's take a little step back and actually discuss what is a chromosome. Okay, so chromosomes, which are kind of pictured all the way down here, are made up of something called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. And here is also, I love to show this fun model to my students, here's also DNA. Okay, and DNA is made up of different components. The important part of DNA that's useful in determining our traits are what we call the quote-unquote rungs, if this is looked at like a ladder, so the middle part. These pieces called nitrogenous bases. Okay, and there are 4 types of bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. All living organisms all have those 4 bases. There's no difference between a bacteria, a fungus, or a human. We all have these same 4 bases. So what makes us different? It's the order of the bases, the sequence of these bases. ACTGCA will cause a different trait in humans as compared to TCTGCA, okay? So this DNA, okay, is organized into units called genes, and each gene codes for a specific protein that's made in our cells, and these proteins give us our traits. Proteins are enzymes, which control our reactions. Proteins are used for our structure. They give us our skin color, our eye color. Okay, so it's the proteins that give us our traits. These genes are lined up end to end to end along the DNA molecule, and the DNA molecule is coiled around proteins called histones, coiled so tightly until we get a chromosome. Okay, and actually, if you take one cell in your body and unravel the DNA, it will be 6 feet long, the DNA within one cell of your body. So it's coiled up so tightly so that it could fit into the nucleus of your cell. Okay, each species has a particular number of chromosomes, and that's what kind of is unique to each species. Anyone know the chromosome number in humans? 46. Okay, so we have 46 chromosomes, 46 of these in each of our cells, and each of our cells have the same chromosomes and the same DNA. Okay, so our chromosomes are organized into pairs. We have 2 of each type of chromosome. Okay, one pair is inherited from our mother's egg, and one pair is inherited from our father's sperm. So that gives us 2 of each type. Okay, so we actually have 23 pairs, 2 of each type. That gives us 46. The first 22 pairs are numbered, and the last pair are considered our sex chromosomes. That's what helps determine our gender, right? And as we mentioned earlier, in females will have XX, and males will have XY. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, this is called a karyotype. It's a picture of the chromosomes of an individual, and we could determine from this that this person is what? A female, okay, that she's XX. Okay. So let's look a little bit at these sex chromosomes. As you see from this picture, so this would be a female, she's XX. This would be a male, who's XY. The Y chromosome is clearly much smaller than the X chromosome. If we're counting how many base pairs, meaning how many letters there are in the X chromosome, there's about 153 million in the X, as compared to only 58 million in the Y. And there are about 2,000 genes in the X chromosome as compared to only 50 or 60 genes in the Y chromosome. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into our Y chromosome. Actually, well, we'll get there soon. Before we do that, okay, let's just again reiterate what we discussed. So if we have a female who's XX and a male who's XY, and they're having offspring, okay, so that means the female's egg cells will automatically have an X chromosome. The male sperm cells, half of them will have a Y and half of them will have an X. So at fertilization, you have a 50-50 chance of getting either a male or a female. The female, the mother, is always going to donate the X chromosome. The father can either donate an X, in which case the offspring will be female, or he'll donate a Y, in which case the offspring will be male. Okay, so it's the father's sperm that's determining the gender of the child. Okay, famously in history, it was Henry VIII, I believe, who went through many different wives, and he kept on killing them and divorcing them because they weren't providing him with a male heir. But actually it was his own fault. I mean, it was his own sperm that wasn't giving the Y chromosome. So, okay. So we're going to get back into the Y chromosome a little bit later, but let's contrast how gender determination from a chromosomal standpoint differs in mammals as compared to different organisms. It's actually really interesting how different organisms work. So we said the mammals have what we call an XY system, okay, that the males are XY, the females are XX. Depending on what's present in the sperm cell, that will determine the chromosomal gender, okay? Insects have something called an XO system, okay, meaning the females, like in mammals, are XX. The males, depending on the insect, they could either be XY or they could just have one X, okay? So in insects, it seems to be that the Y chromosome isn't really important in determining male-female Rather, it's the number of X chromosomes. 2 X's means female, 1 X means male, okay? So I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but this kind of could cause some interesting results because there could be some disorders during the formation of sperm and egg in which the chromosomes don't separate properly, and you could end up with a sperm cell with an X and a Y instead of just an X or a Y, or an X cell with 2 X's. So in humans, there are 2 disorders, one called Klinefelter syndrome and one called Turner syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome is a person whose chromosomes are XXY, and Turner syndrome is a person whose chromosomes just have 1 X. Okay? So if this person is a person versus if this person is an insect, okay, how would that affect whether it's a male or a female? What do you think? If this person is a person and we have XXY, is that going to be a male or a female? It's going to be a male because the Y chromosome, and we'll go into more detail about this, is of utmost importance in determining the gender of a male. But if this person is an insect, what is it going to be? It's going to be a female, okay? The Y chromosome seems irrelevant here, okay? And compared to someone who's XO, that's going to be a female in humans, but that's going to be a male in insects because the Y chromosome isn't as important, okay? Some birds and some fish have something called a ZW system, all right? So while in mammals, the females have 2 of the same chromosome and the males have 2 different chromosomes, it's different in the birds, all right? In birds, the female has 2 different chromosomes, a Z and a W, and the male has 2 of the same chromosomes, 2 Z's. Okay, so in birds and these fish, it's the female who ends up determining the gender of her offspring. All right, if her egg gives a Z, then the offspring will be male, and if the egg gives a W, the offspring will be female. And we call these chromosomes ZW or not XY because they're actually very different from the X and the Y chromosome. They don't share any genes in common with the X and Y chromosome. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it's thought that they actually descended from chromosome number 9. They share some genes with our chromosome number 9. So it's thought that that's where it kind of stemmed from. Okay? Bees have a really interesting way of determining gender. It's something called the haplodiploid system. Okay? So how does this work? We have a queen bee, and she has 32 chromosomes. Okay? We did this in AP Bio. Some of you girls may remember. Okay? She has 32 chromosomes, and she is the only one who's reproducing. All right? So she's making eggs with 16 chromosomes. If those eggs do not get fertilized, they will spontaneously develop into an adult male. Okay, so the male bees develop from unfertilized queen eggs. If those eggs do get fertilized, that will result in other females. Okay, so that's called the haplodiploid system. The term diploid refers to the fact that there are 2 copies of every gene, and we see that in the queens and in the queen and in the females. The term haploid refers to only 1 copy of every gene, and that's in the males. Okay? Finally, surprisingly, Aristotle may not have been all that wrong because in some fish and reptiles, temperature does help determine the gender. And this is called temperature-dependent sex determination. How does this work? Okay? The temperature at which the eggs are incubated during the middle third of embryonic development will determine the overall gender of the offspring, because the temperature influences the amounts of hormones that are released in these organisms, okay? So it's only about a period of 7 to 15 days, and the temperature has to remain constant during those 7 to 15 days in order for it to work, all right? And after that period, the sex can't be reversed. So generally, eggs incubated at a lower temperature, meaning like about 70 to 80 degrees, produce one sex, and eggs incubated at about 86 degrees produce the other sex, and then in the middle it'll be both. Okay, so we see that, okay, maybe Aristotle did have some root in science and that temperature can determine gender, although not in humans. Okay, so let's go back to the human and the mammals, and let's focus more on the Y chromosome. So we said in humans it's the Y chromosome that's of utmost importance in determining the outcome of a male gender. So what about the Y chromosome helps determine gender? All right? There are a bunch of genes on the Y chromosome. It has, as I said earlier, about 50 to 60 genes. The gene that determines gender is this one gene up here called the SRY gene, or the sex-determining region on the Y chromosome. All right, the other genes are important for male fertility, and there are actually some genes that have nothing to do with gender, that are just regular genes needed for normal development. But it's this SRY gene, okay, that helps determine the gender. How does that work? Okay, the SRY gene, all right, let's do this. Okay, so early on in development of an embryo, all right, in the first 7 weeks, the embryo has something called an uncommitted duct system, or it's called a bipotential gonad. It is neither male nor is it female. It has this basis of something that can either develop into the male gonads or the female gonads. Okay, at about 7 weeks of development, that SRY gene, if it is present on the Y chromosome, gets turned on, and it causes the development of something called these seminiferous tubules, which are the tubes found inside the testes. Okay, and that's going to start the differentiation of these gonads into the male gonads, the testes. That stimulates cells within the testes to produce testosterone, the male hormone, and another hormone called Mullerian inhibiting hormone, which will kind of stop the female development and make sure that it becomes male. Okay, so as I said, this starts at about 7 weeks into conception. Okay, so if the Y chromosome is present versus if the Y chromosome is absent. If the Y chromosome is present, we start to get the formation of testes. If there's no Y chromosome, the default option is female. Okay, it's the default. It's what's going to happen if there's no Y gene and if there's no Y chromosome and there's no SRY gene. Okay. Once we have the gonads developing properly, then the rest of the genitals and the internal system will develop properly. Okay, so we'll have all the structures that'll come from that point. And then we'll clearly be able to see the distinction between males and females in their development. Okay, so we just discussed how the chromosomal gender, the XX versus XY, influences and causes for the development of the gonadal gender, the testes and the ovaries. Okay, and we said it's because of the expression of this SRY gene. All right, and again, the default is female. So if there's no SRY gene, ovaries are going to form instead of testes, and something called the Mullerian duct system will form, which will be the oviduct, the uterus, and the female genitals. Okay, once we have the gonads developing properly, then the phenotypic gender will develop. And again, this is the physical appearance. What the person looks like on the outside. So let's trace through the whole path. We have an egg with the X chromosome. How do we get a female versus how do we get a male? All right. So first, if it's fertilized by a sperm with a Y chromosome versus fertilized with a sperm with an X chromosome, we get our genetic sex. An embryo either with XX or an embryo with XY. Okay. Once we have the genetic sex, right, the Y chromosome, the SRY gene will get turned on, causing the formation of the testes. No SRY gene because there's no Y chromosome, so the default is ovaries. We've established our gonadal sex, okay? Once we have that, the different gonads will release different hormones. The male gonads will release testosterone. The female gonads will not release testosterone, all right? So then we'll have the phenotypic sex. All right, that if there is testosterone, the reproductive tract and external genitals will develop along the male lines. If there's no testosterone, then the female genitals and female external development will occur. Okay, so this is how it should be, right? They're all linked together. Genetic sex influences gonadal sex, influences phenotypic sex, and this is typically how it works. However, there could be disorders of sex development. Meaning something could go wrong at any of these points, okay? And I actually want to also bring in sort of a fourth level of gender determination, and this is not in the biological definition of gender of sex. This is how you feel what your gender is, and that refers to your psyche, okay? How you internally feel what your gender is, okay? Your sexual identity. Do you feel male or do you feel female? And typically, that also follows along the same lines. Genetic sex is male, gonadal sex is male, phenotypic sex is male. Your psyche is you feel male. The same with a female. However, the disorders of sex development may stop after phenotypic sex, so that even if all three of these are along one line, the fourth can be a different line. So in order for all four to develop properly, we need the appropriate chromosomes, we need the appropriate genes, we need the release of the appropriate hormones. We also need your cells to be able to recognize those hormones. We have on our cells something called receptors, which are programmed to recognize hormones. Okay, so we need to be able to recognize those hormones, and then everything else will fall into play. But not many, there are disorders where something goes wrong along one of those steps. All right, and that's what we're going to discuss now. Okay, this is called disorders of sex development. All right, so let's start off with two that are kind of linked together. Something called an XX male, otherwise known as de la Chapelle syndrome, or an XY female, otherwise known as Swyer syndrome. So how can you have someone who's XX and end up being a male? Okay, so the answer is that while you form your gametes, something called crossing over occurs. Meaning your chromosome pairs will often switch pieces of DNA with each other. And in most cases, this is actually good because you're promoting variety. You're switching a hair color gene on one chromosome with the hair color gene on another chromosome. So while one may have blonde hair, the other have brown hair, you've switched places. You've recombined the genes. This is not supposed to happen among the sex chromosomes because the sex chromosomes don't share all of the same genes. Sometimes it can happen, which will mean that SRY gene, that critical gene for the formation of a male, could end up being on the tip of an X chromosome instead of its rightful place on the Y chromosome. So if we have a sperm cell, okay, that has this X chromosome with the SRY gene, and it's fertilized by an egg cell with an X, that SRY gene will turn on and start to differentiate the gonads into testes, and then testosterone will be produced, and then the phenotypic gender will be male. Okay, so this is actually a pretty rare condition. It's found in about 4 to 5 of every 100,000 individuals. These people are typical boys and men. They have testes, their external genital is male, they will feel male. Okay, the only difference is their testes will actually be a little bit small and they'll be sterile. And if you do a karyotype, you will see that they are XX instead of XY. But for everything else, for their gonadal gender, their phenotypic gender, and their psyche, they will feel male, not female. Okay? And the reverse can happen with a female. Either that SRY gene may cross over onto an X, so you'll end up with a Y chromosome without the SRY gene, or that SRY gene will be mutated and it won't do its proper function. Okay, so you could have a Y chromosome without that SRY gene being fertilized, so you will have an individual whose XY should be male, but because that SRY gene isn't functioning, the gonadal gender, the phenotypic gender, and their psyche will feel female, okay? And they will not actually have ovaries. They'll have something called a streak gonad, a non-functional gonad that will not produce eggs. At puberty, their secondary sex characteristics, all their body changes that come along with puberty actually won't happen. But from the outside, that's something that's relatively easy to change. You could give somebody with this disorder estrogen or progesterone therapy in order to stimulate their secondary sex characteristics, but that won't make the person be able to produce eggs. Their ovaries are not functioning. Okay, so too, this person will feel female and will look female in all respects, except that their chromosomal gender will be of the opposite gender. Okay. Another disorder that could cause inconsistencies is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Okay, so here, in this case, the person, okay, can be XY, all right, and will produce testes, okay, but at some point along the development, the receptors that are supposed to recognize the testosterone are not recognizing the testosterone. So there's actually a really big range in symptoms with people with androgen insensitivity. It could be partially insensitive, and in those cases, the person will really, for the most part, look female and have testes. But you could also have complete androgen insensitivity, okay, where the whole outside of the body, the genitals, and the whole phenotypic gender will look female because the testosterone hasn't been recognized. Generally, in people with complete androgen insensitivity, however, they will actually have testes. So their testes will form, but everything from that point on will not form because the testosterone isn't causing it to form properly. All right? Most people with complete androgen insensitivity identify as female, meaning they identify with what their phenotype looks like. They will look female and they will think of themselves as female. There's a small minority that identify as male. And a question among this arises is, well, are they considered transgender if they have a testes but feel female? Okay, or are they considered transgender if they have a testes but feel male because their external phenotype is female? So there's a lot of contention about this. And actually, people with this disorder, once it becomes public that they have it, they could be stigmatized against because people could not feel that they are behaving in the true gender that maybe they should be. All right. Now, a famous urban legend, as I was researching this, is that there is an actress who rumors have swirled around her that she has complete androgen insensitivity. Anyone know who I'm referring to? Okay, an actress. I don't know if the younger among us will know her. Someone named Jamie Lee Curtis. Okay, that she has a very androgynous appearance, and I read in one case like, oh, that's why she's named Jamie Lee, because that could go either way. But then, I read somewhere else that that's totally not true. Her mom said, no, I just like the name. It has nothing to do with, I wasn't sure what gender she is. She also actually has adopted 2 children. She has not had any of her own biological children, so that's also why some people say, clearly, she really has a testes and, she has complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. There has never been proof that she actually has this disorder. It's never, ever been credited by her that she has that. But that's something that's been out there for a long time, that she actually has this disorder. Okay? Finally, we have a really rare condition called true gonadal intersex. In this case, the person is born with both ovarian and testicular tissue. Oh, sorry, before we get to that, one more, okay? No? Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, all right? So you have 2 glands called the adrenal glands that are on top of your kidneys, and they produce androgens, which is the precursor to testosterone. So in some cases, there could be a disorder of the adrenal glands where they're overproducing these androgens. Okay, this won't have such an effect on males, but if you have a female who's overproducing androgens, she's going to have more testosterone in her body, and that could affect her external genitals. It can make it become more masculinized. So internally, she may have ovaries, okay, and she may be XX, but externally, she may appear to be male. Okay, and there's also, like in the last disorder, there's a range of symptoms in this. It could be just mildly masculinized or really completely masculinized to look like a real male genital. Okay, females with this disorder contain ovaries and a uterus, but are generally infertile. Okay, so finally, the true gonadal intersex, somebody who's born with both ovarian and testicular tissue. So this could present itself in 2 different ways. Either someone could have an ovary underneath the testes on both sides. More commonly, it's that in both of the gonads, there are both ovarian and testicular tissue. Okay, this is very, very rare and can result from a variety of ways, maybe through a mutation in the SRY gene, or, interestingly, you could have an ovum, an egg cell, and another ovum that the female releases, and both could be fertilized by 2 different sperm, and they can fuse together very early on and make one child, one baby. Okay, it's called a chimera. All right, so if one was a male and one was a female, you could have both tissues present. Okay, there are no documented cases in which both of the types of gonadal tissue function. Okay, and the external genitals are generally ambiguous. All right, so before we move on to transgender, I just want to spend a little bit talking about the term hermaphrodite. All right. In the past, the term hermaphrodite was generally erroneously used to refer to people who are intersex or have what's called disorders of sex development. Okay, this term is not used now in reference to humans or really any other mammals. The correct technical difference of hermaphrodite is a single organism that has both complete sets of gonads and functioning sets of gonads. And that is generally the case in trees and flowering plants. Okay, so we do not use the term hermaphrodite in reference to mammals. All right, so let's spend a minute talking about transgenderism. All right, so with transgenderism, it's kind of unique in that the first three levels go according to plan. The chromosomal gender is set, the gonadal gender is set, the phenotypic gender is set, but the psyche is not, okay? In the case of transgenderism and in the previous cases of disorders of sex development, okay, parents with children with sex development disorders, they usually try to make it very clear, like a distinction between biological sex and social gender, meaning the psyche, and sexual orientation, because those are three very different things, very different factors that are not necessarily related to one another.
Hi, can Hannah Fish, Nina Miller, Donnie Wayne, Tara Nurshell, Elisheva Cohen, Aura Friedman, Mrs. Herzog, Denny Tamam, Hannah Siegel, Ayala Martyr, Leora Wolf, Leora Feder, Claudia Robinson, Shauna Gersbaum, Shana Dewis, Dr. Levine, Navigala Shapiro, please remember to pick up their Talia before they leave. Thank you.
Okay. So in my research about what causes transgenderisms, I found some ideas, but it also seems that it's still not completely clear. Okay, in one study that I read, a scientist by the name of Olson found that transgender youth have sex hormones that are consistent with the gender that's assigned to them at birth. So someone who is chromosomally male, but feels female, will still have the normal amounts of testosterone as compared to other males. And the same is true for females that are transgender. But a study that was done in 2008 showed that actually the gene that codes for the receptor for the sex hormones, all right, to recognize those sex hormones, has a higher chance of being mutated in transgender people as compared to non-transgender people. And specifically, they were looking at transgender males. Okay, that male to female transgenders have longer repeats of this gene that codes for the receptors for testosterone, and that it reduces the effectiveness of binding and recognizing testosterone. So it could be that while everything started off progressing as it should with the chromosomal gender and the gonadal gender and the phenotypic gender, it had its influence in developing the psyche. Okay, so again, there's still a lot of research that's being done on the causes of transgenderisms, but it does seem to, in some cases, have a genetic link in that, like, it could be a mutation of a certain gene. It can, in some cases, have a hormonal link, but it's not completely understood. Okay, so now that we've learned about all the different definitions of gender, let's revisit the two cases that we started off this lecture with. Casper Semenya. So let's finish up her story, okay? In November of 2009, it was announced that Semenya reached an agreement with the association that was doing the gender test on her, and she was allowed to keep her medal and prize money. And in 2010, she was cleared to return to competition. The results of the gender test were never released due to privacy, okay? But from what we just learned, it could be that maybe she had androgen insensitivity, and that maybe she is XY, okay, and has testes, but from the external standpoint, she may appear female. So, I mean, this is just guesswork because it's never actually been released for privacy. In the Summer Olympics of 2012, she was chosen to carry her country's flag for the opening ceremony, and she later won a silver medal in the women's 800 meters of this game. All right. Now, in the Olympics, actually, gender verification was dropped all the way back in 1999. All right. And one reason why was because actually when they did it in 1996, they found that 8 out of the 3,387 female athletes that were competing tested positive for the SRY gene. They were XY. Okay. So likely they had androgen insensitivity, but they were still allowed to compete in the Olympics, okay? Now, what the Olympics now does is instead of doing gender testing like that, they are looking for hormone levels, okay? Like they're measuring the levels of testosterone, and they've established a limit as to how much testosterone is acceptable for a female to have in order to compete as a female. But even that is an unreliable standard. Okay, some women just naturally will have higher levels of testosterone. Also, the levels could vary depending on the time of day, the time of life, and one's history of athletic training. Also, we've seen that your reception of that testosterone can differ. So just measuring testosterone isn't really a great indication of male versus female. All right? And something that I found actually even more interesting is that it really highlights this cruel injustice, okay? This treatment of Casper Semenya, all of this gender testing has only been applied to female athletes, all right? What about the male athletes who excel, let's say, at ice dancing or synchronized swimming, a sport that requires a lot of grace and balance, traits which are typically affiliated with females, okay? They aren't questioned the same way women are. In fact, in 2010, there were 2 French-Canadian sports commentators who were commenting over figure skater Johnny Wire's performance, and they suggested that he should compete with the females, okay? And they were immediately condemned for their homophobic remarks and their despicable language. And this was at the very same time that Casper Semenya was living in exile over her her gender testing. So, you know, that's something else to think about, okay? And what about Caitlyn Jenner? Okay, by all accounts, his chromosomal gender, his gonadal gender, and his phenotypic gender started off male. Okay, so clearly something happened between the development of his phenotypic gender and his psyche, his sexual association with gender. Okay, so again, it's not completely known, but perhaps it is because of his hormones and how they were received during his early development. Okay, so thus ends our discussion. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you learned something. Does anyone have any questions? We're just about done. Do you have a question?
I have a question. Are they able to take, I mean, like two men, XY, and then test 2 and make the man?
Right.
They take XX and XY
Right.
because the female can always produce the female.
Okay,
But
so in order for a zygote and a baby to properly develop, besides for the DNA from each, something else that the egg contributes is the cytoplasm and the organelles and all of the kind of signals that are present in that egg. So if you're just, okay, so now I just thought of something else. So if you're just taking 2 sperm that are X and combining it, it wouldn't work. But potentially, you could take the nucleus out of a sperm, put it into remove the nucleus of an egg, put that in there, and then merge it. There's a lot of laws about, like, especially when we're dealing with humans,
so the
there's a lot of ethical rules.
But the woman could never create.
The woman can never. Right. So theoretically, hypothetically, I believe it could be done.
Man, like from the Torah, woman was created from man.
Right.
So,
Right.
if you think about it
So,
that way,
just to note, as I was preparing this, I was thinking, how does this relate to halacha? Well, how would someone who's XY, but for everything else, like if they had that SRY gene that's mutated, and for everything, appear female, how would halacha approach somebody like that? Would they be halachically male or female? I mean, this presentation in itself took a long time, so I didn't get to research that, but that might be something that would be something that I would be interested in learning about as well. Does this correlate with halachic implications? So, yes?
The concern in sports, as I understand it, is that you don't want the female to have an extra physical advantage, strength or whatever,
Right.
Competing against other women.
Right.
Are there other hormones besides testosterone that would have an influence on strength, for example, as a criteria?
I'm sorry, right. Steroids are the precursor to testosterone, so they are related. But I can't think off the top of my head of an unrelated hormone that would also. That's an interesting question. Like, are they testing for those hormones as well? So, yes, Mayan?
What led them to do the testing on Semenya? Because if it was just that she was so good and
Right.
she was a female, that seems like illegal. It's
Right.
gender discrimination.
Right. So I wonder if, and it's not so clear from the picture, if you search pictures from her, she does not have this overall female look. But that also seems very discriminatory. Just because she happens to look a little manly and she happens to be the best, I don't know what clear factors they had in saying, you know what, this is something we really have to do. It does seem very discriminatory. Okay, yes?
I'm just wondering, with this, if you're thinking about the gay community, can there be pieces of this?
Okay, so from what I've read in preparing this, your sexual orientation is completely independent of any of these factors. So, for example, in some of the disorders that I read about, the XY male and XY female and XX male, there you had a range of sexual orientations, and it wasn't that people with this disorder are more likely to be homosexual versus heterosexual. So from what I found, it was independent.
But because sometimes if you meet, like say in the male community, there are some who, their speech is a little different. You can identify that there is something.
Correct.
That
So clearly that's also something that's been studied in recent years, is what is a factor that influences your sexual orientation. But your psyche is also independent of your sexual orientation. Just because you're a transgender, you could be transgender and attracted to the opposite sex of what you were born with, okay? So like Bruce Jenner is attracted to females, even though he feels female. Or you could have transgenders who are attracted to the same sex that they were born in. So those are also two not necessarily related categories. So that's something that I also was like, should I include that too? But that's a whole other lecture, yeah. Okay, yeah.
When you were talking about, it goes from like this face to
Yeah,
this face,
yeah.
you said there was like the androgen.
Androgens, yeah.
Does that have to do when people say a woman who looks manly?
Androgynous, yeah. Androgens are the precursors to testosterone. So I guess there probably is some related root to that. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to end. If you have other questions, feel free to come up. But thank you so much for joining me today.